Okay, I know Rabbi Serotta does not need an introduction, but I feel all of our speakers deserve an introduction, and then we can clap. Rabbi Ike Serotta, and this is on our website, is committed both word and deed to social justice. I mean, I could have gone to LinkedIn or Facebook. I just thought I'm going to go with what's on our website. He is a strong advocate for civil rights, women's rights, voters' rights, LGBTQIA rights, and immigrant and refugee rights. He is also active in interfaith dialogue with service as past president of the Southeast Lake County Clergy Association and similar roles with the Greater Milwaukee Interfaith Council, as well as the National Conference of Christians and Jews. He teaches regularly in interfaith study groups. Rabbi Serotta was a pioneer in officiating at LGBTQIA weddings and continues to offer counsel and officiation today. He also works closely with interfaith couples to officiate at meaningful wedding celebrations and with families of all kinds as they plan naming and other rituals and educational experiences for children. Rabbi Serotta is easily approachable to both adults and children. Call Stephanie if you want an appointment. He is passionate about sports, music, and movies. We have a very good movie class. Congregants consider him to be scholarly, highly personable, and uncommonly kind and caring. Rabbi Serotta is married to Celia Liber. Raise your hand. That's the real reason I'm introducing him, so I can introduce you. And has 3 children, Yehuda, Vered, and Alicia. So, with no further ado, and I believe I was their emergency contact until about, I don't know, last year. Yes, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. I don't think I wrote that. I wonder who wrote that, actually. Yeah, yeah, you're right. No, it's definitely on our website and from before AI. So, but thank you for sharing that. And actually, before I start, I want to mention some of the formative influences on my life, in addition to my own family, of course, my parents, of blessed memory, who were certainly social justice activists all through their lives. But the rabbis who really helped form me. So growing up, it was a guy named Joe Narrett, who was the rabbi of Temple Israel in Greater Miami for 25 years or so, and spoke frequently from the pulpit on issues of social justice. You know, this was in South Florida. So issues of civil rights, and was an early opponent of the Vietnam War. So that had a profound influence on me as a child. And then as I got a little older, I ended up in correspondence with a couple of rabbis when I was in high school and then college. Abraham Kronbach, who was actually a teacher at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati for many years, and wrote a book called Reform Movements in Judaism, which goes back through Jewish history and talks about all the different times that Judaism went through reform, and was one of the folks who really helped people. He wrote books on how to deal with your draft board during Vietnam and things like that. And another rabbi of the same generation around the same time, but who lived until just a few years ago, Rabbi Everett Gembler, who for a while was the oldest rabbi in the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And every year, one of the highlights of the convention is a breakfast on the last day of the conference where they do a roll call of all the classes. And they say the class of 1988, and my class, you know, stands up and everybody applauds. And then they would keep going back and back and back until they got to Everett. Right, you know, so the last one standing from his graduating class, which I think was like 1930 something, you know. So, he wrote a book about pacifism and the rabbinate. And then when I was actually in rabbinic school and serving a congregation in New Jersey, there were 2 rabbis in New Jersey at that time that became friends and became important to me. One was Cy Dresner, who just died in the last couple of years. And Cy was really, he was a freedom rider. And he would, more than just being someone on the bus, he was the guy who organized the rabbis who got on the bus with Dr. King and all those folks. So he spent time in jail in places like St. Augustine, which Dr. King said was the worst prison he was ever held in. The worst jail in the country was St. Augustine, Florida. Cy was right there with him, you know. An incredible influence. And last, but certainly not least, is Joachim Prinz, who was a rabbi in Newark, New Jersey. Well, he started his rabbinic career in Germany during the Weimar Republic, and then came as a refugee to the United States and became a rabbi in Newark, New Jersey. And when I was serving a small congregation in Elizabeth, I would visit him in the senior living facility that he lived in, and he would regale me with stories. If you want to see him, you know, he gave a pretty great speech on the morning of the March on Washington that nobody remembers because he had the misfortune of speaking before Dr. King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech. So, but it was a pretty good speech nonetheless. And so these are some of the people whose shoulders I stand on today, and you know, they mean a lot to me. So I just wanted to mention them all in this moment. I'm going to try to get through a lot of text here today. And so I'm going to try to leave time for questions for the end. So let's see if we can get through some stuff. But I want to make an argument about resistance in Jewish tradition, that it's always been with us, that this is nothing new, and that it really goes all the way back to the beginning stories of the Torah. And that even our understanding of the story of the Garden of Eden could be seen as a story of resistance, right? That God models for us in a way. God gives us this rule: don't eat from this tree. And we say, we're going to eat from that tree, right? And, you know, we don't interpret that story in the way that I think, you know, in the Christian world, it's interpreted as the story of the fall of man and the beginning of original sin, these kinds of things. That's not really the Jewish view of this. I mean, we don't believe in original sin. We don't believe that human beings are sinful by nature. Right? So the story means something else. So I think, you know, when I talk to kids about it, I often talk about it as a kind of a mythological story, right? This is similar to Prometheus stealing fire. It's something that had to happen, right? For human beings to become human beings, for human civilization to advance, it needs to happen. And so if you can sort of flip the script on this and say, God sets a rule for us that God knows we can't keep, because God wants us to know how to resist when people try to oppress us. Right? So that's a different way of looking at the story than we usually do. But then the first text that I actually gave you on the paper that you can see here is also from the book of Genesis. Right? So first book of the Torah, of course. And it's a story I think that's probably familiar to most of us. The story of when God decides to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? So, and famously, Abraham doesn't go quietly into that. You know, God reveals to Abraham that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham stands up. Right? Abraham resists, if you want to use that language, and has this debate with God. I gave you just the beginning of it, but because I think everybody knows this story, right? But Abraham comes forward and speaks right to God, you know? So, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? So, of course, that's just the beginning, right? Because God says, no, if there are 50 innocent people, I won't destroy the city. And Abraham says, well, what about 40? You know, and God says, oh, if there are 40, no, we won't destroy the city. 30, you know, and they go through this until Abraham gets God down to 10. If we can find 10 righteous people in Sodom, God says, won't destroy it, right? So I think this, again, is an example here of God giving us a model, right? And our tradition giving us a model that we stand up for the things we believe in. We try and push back on whatever the authority figure says. Now, we're going to see much more of this as we go, but I think this is the start, right? It starts right there in Genesis. And then let's go to Exodus. And there are plenty of examples in Exodus, right? So Moses going to Pharaoh and saying, let my people go. I didn't give you that text because I think you all know that text, right? What is that if it's not resistance, right? It's going in to speak truth to power. It's going in and saying, what you're doing is wrong, and we have to do something about that. But here's this other one that sometimes maybe we miss in the story of Exodus. It's become very important, I think, in feminist theology, this story. But I think for a lot of other folks, I don't know how many of you know the story of Shifra and Puah. My sister's Hebrew name is Shifra, actually. So I think that means my parents were thinking about it, actually, when she was born. So that tells you something about them. But so Shifra and Puah are the midwives. Right. And remember, Pharaoh has decreed that all the boy children of the Israelites should be killed, should be thrown into the Nile and practice infanticide. Right. So, but the midwives defy that order. Right? And, and so the midwives fearing God, fearing in the old sense of that translation, in awe of God, right? Did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? And Shifra and Puah tell the king a little bit of a story, right? That this is, well, the women of Israel are so hardy and strong, they're giving birth in secret. So we don't actually see whether they have a boy, right? But nevertheless, what they've done is they're defying the orders of the king. I mean, it's very, very clear that that's what they're doing. That's a story that they tell to the king, so that they don't get their heads cut off. And there actually doesn't, the king seems to believe it. The Pharaoh doesn't kill them. So we have an example of resistance, I think, very much there. So this one from Exodus, just a little earlier in that first chapter. I think this is speaks to a different aspect of resistance, right? But this is in sort of the preamble, if you like, to the book of Exodus, and this idea of why the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites and put them into slavery. And the argument is that we have to keep them down. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So one of the things we talk about when we talk about resistance is making alliances, right? Making friends, bringing groups together, organizing. Right? So this is maybe the Egyptians trying to legislate against organizing. Right? So if we put them into slavery, they won't be able to organize. They won't have the strength or the power that otherwise they might to make the change. So I would say that this is, something the Egyptians do that we're kind of implicitly told in the text is the wrong thing to do to other people, right? That it's important as people who want to resist, it's important to organize. It's very hard to do these things by yourself. Right? So, but getting organized is a threat to the system. So the system will do everything it can to keep us from organizing. Right? So, I just want to go back to Moses for just a second. And remember when God calls to Moses, Moses says, "I'm not the guy. Right? I'm not a good public speaker. I'm not really able to do this." And God says to Moses, "No, you're the perfect one to do it." And let's think about that for a minute. When Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go," how does he know who his people? Does he know? uh, Moses was raised in the palace of Pharaoh, right? Speaking the language of Pharaoh. I mean, this may be why he's the perfect person to do this, because he's someone who can get access to Pharaoh. So picking the representative, it's worth thinking about, right? But goes into Pharaoh. And so Moses is raised as an Egyptian. He's married to a Midianite. And he says, let my people go, meaning the Israelites, right? So I think it's not always something that necessarily touches your own life that you advocate for, right? It's not only something that applies to you. You see what's happening to other people and it causes you to want to resist, right? So that's Moses, right? And again, that's an interesting model for us. Jews first got involved in the civil rights struggle because it applied to us, right? If you look at the history of the NAACP, for example, the first several presidents of the NAACP were Jews, right? Because when we thought about the concept of colored people back in the 1920s, when the organization was formed, that included us, right? The last Jewish president of the NAACP was a guy named Kivi Kaplan. He was actually at my bar mitzvah. He was a friend of my mother's from the Commission on Social Action of what was then the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the URJ. And they sat together at conference meetings and passed notes about what they were going to have for lunch. Some of which we found after my mom died, her files. So notes from Kivi Kaplan, which are now in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. So that goes well into the 1960s. And so, by that time, there's a book, I talked about this a number of years ago about how Jews became white people. And that was someone's doctoral dissertation that got published. It's a pretty good book, pretty scholarly, but it shows how that changed, right? So Jews were involved in the civil rights struggle, not so much for ourselves, but because we saw the oppression of others and continued to be involved. And so Moses is an interesting figure in that regard. Worth thinking about that. We're going to move from the Torah itself to some of the Talmudic texts and Midrashic texts that I wanted to bring to you today. So this one, I think we're on text number 4 here, if you're following along. And you'll see that this really speaks to this idea that it's not only about what's going on for us. It's about what's going on in the world that's important. And seeing how other people are struggling and how other people are oppressed and what we have to do about it. Someone feel like reading out loud from the crowd? Or did I hear a shore somewhere? Babs, yeah, I can always count on you. I can do the first few words. Rav and Rav Hanina and Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Haviva taught.
To protest the sinful conduct of the members of their household and did not protest, they are apprehended for the members of their household. If they are in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the people of their town, and they fail to do so, they are apprehended for the people of their town. If they are in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the whole world, and they fail to do so, they are apprehended for the whole world. So
it seems very clear to me from the text in the Talmud that we are told to speak up, right? And not just about things that affect us, right? But if it affects the world, it's our issue too. This maybe comes from the idea, among others, that we're all descendants of the same people, right? We all come from Adam and Eve, so we're all one family. So if you would stand up for someone in your own family, then you would stand up for someone elsewhere in the world. It's nice that Babs read that, because I consider one of the great successes of my rabbinic career is Babs and Bob's granddaughter. actually, who started out on a path because I gave a sermon about slavery and slavery in the modern world, that there are 27 million slaves in the world today. And as a girl, she heard that sermon and really took it to heart, and now has finished law school and is, working on this issue, has become central to what she does. So there's no greater praise for me as a teacher than what Eliana does. So thanks for reading that. It's she takes this message to heart, I think, right? That you have to speak up for the whole world. So and I think well, I kind of let the cat out of the bag on number 5, but just show it to you quickly. Rabbi Akiva taught, love your neighbor as yourself. This is the most important rule in the Torah. But one of the other rabbis disagrees, right? We might think that that is, love your neighbor as yourself is the most important. Ben Azai says, this is a line from the book of Genesis, from a part that we don't really read and we sort of pass over. This is the genealogy from Adam to Noah, right? And the beginning of that genealogy, which is just a whole list of names and how long they lived. And this is where Methuselah shows up and Enoch shows up. And, it's when we're doing Torah study, we usually skip this part, right? Because it's just names and years, right? But Ben Azai says, the most important thing is this is the written record of the human line. So what he means by that is what I said a minute ago, right? That from Adam to us, right, we're all part of the same family. Not just Jews, all human beings are descended from the same pair, right? Now, that may not be literally true. Okay? We understand that's not a scientific idea, but it's a cultural idea, and it's Ben Azai says it's the most important thing to remember, because how can you possibly hate another person? Well, you can hate people in your own family, but generally you don't go out to war against them, right? So that's the idea that Ben Azai is getting at. So and then this is from a Midrashic collection, the 6th text here. And it's about this question, the most repeated law in the Torah is you shall not oppress a stranger. And sometimes the reason is given because, remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. But this text goes even a little farther, right? It's not just about us being slaves in Egypt. Even before that, Abraham called himself a stranger, as it is said, and again, a quote from Genesis, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you, right? And then later in the Bible, King David, and now we're in the land, we're established, we have a king, and David called himself a stranger. And this stretches a little bit for us. The Psalms are attributed to King David. So Psalm 119 says, I am a stranger in the earth. Right? And so that's attributed to David as a writer of Psalms. So, and it also says, for we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our ancestors were. Our days on the earth are as a shadow, and there is no abiding. That comes from First Chronicles. And then it says again in Psalms, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner, as all my ancestors were. So we talk about we shouldn't oppress a stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. But the truth is that this text is suggesting to us that every human being is a stranger. So because, even when you use that phrase, don't oppress the stranger, you're actually creating a kind of an us and them, right? There's sort of a binary here, like we're the ones who are settled here, and you are the stranger who is with us, and we won't oppress you, but we don't necessarily think of you as an equal, right? But if we think of all human beings as strangers in a kind of an existential sense, then that changes the meaning of that, right? Do not oppress a stranger. It becomes really do not oppress anyone. So, so it gives us a sense of what the mission is. So if you look at these last couple as kind of a whole, I mean, that's what it's telling us, that we have a mission to make the world better. And that requires resisting anyone who isn't moving in that direction. So, we're having a debate in this country about birthright citizenship, which is an important, really important topic, a really important debate, but it's almost, from a Jewish point of view, beside the point, right? Because the question is treating all human beings equally. And so if that's the goal, then birthright citizenship is just a small part of a larger goal, right? Of making the world whole, making it perhaps so that either everyone recognizes that they're a stranger all the time. These stories that come from I think from Native American heritage, about people are debating about who owns this piece of property, and we don't own the earth owns us. Right? It's a different kind of way of looking at the world. Back to the Bible for a minute, and another famous story that perhaps this comes from the story of David and Bathsheba. We've just read about David, and David is a stranger, but this is the story of the prophet in David's court, a guy named Nathan. And Nathan comes to King David after the episode with Bathsheba. You remember that story, right? So David sees Bathsheba and wants her. And so he arranges to have her husband Uzziah sent to the front, the battle, and not only sent to the front, but then have the rest of the troops withdraw so that he's sure to be killed, right? And then, so Uzziah is killed, and David is free to take Bathsheba, and Nathan comes to him and tells him this story. So would someone like to read the story at the bottom of page 1? Well, Babs is volunteering again, but it's Alan. Alan likes to read too, so.
There's also more bagels. I give you permission. I leave it on the bagel.
He came to him and said, there were 2 men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich one had very large flocks and herds, but the poor one had only one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He tended it, and it grew up together with him and his children. He used to share his morsel of bread, drink from his cup, and nestle in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. One day a traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flock or herds to prepare a meal for the guest who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. David flew into a rage against the man and said to Nathan, as God lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and showed no pity. And Nathan said to David, you are the man.
So you got to imagine that, right? And that strength that Nathan shows to go into King David's palace, speak to the king, and tell him how sinful he's been. Right? That is a really, really hard thing to do, And so again, we have a great role model in our tradition of speaking truth to power. Now, the problem here, of course, is that David can't do anything about that at this point, right? So the goal would actually be to stop behavior before it causes death, something that we as human beings are really bad at. It seems, as a race, we haven't figured out as a human race how to keep from killing people in the name of good. But I wouldn't say that so resistance goes on through the centuries in our tradition. And we see it, and sometimes it does involve taking up arms, right? That there is armed resistance. I mean, if we think about the Maccabees, fighting against the Greek Assyrian empire that had taken over, right? That is a kind of resistance too. So we shouldn't automatically think that resistance is always bloodless, and it's not. And so there are times when it seems to be, this is where I would disagree with some of my teachers, Everett Gendler, who was a proponent of pacifism in all situations, right? But there are times when people need to take up arms, and so we have to understand that. But we also have to understand that we talk about the Maccabees and their struggle at the start is heroic and their end is corrupt. So we need to remember that once a revolution happens, right, the revolution itself can become corrupt and need to be replaced. So that's also really important to remember. We also, of course, see guerrilla fighters, fighting against Roman rule, or the army of Bar Kokhba, which, nearly beat the Roman Empire and got them out of the land of ancient Judea at that time, right? The Romans had to bring troops from as far away as England, which was no easy task back in the days of ancient Rome, right, to defeat Bar Kokhba. So it's not always peaceful resistance. It's not always orderly. Sometimes it's quieter, like the prophet Nathan, in the sense that someone who can come in and speak truth to power. Sometimes it's subversive. Right? It's, which I would say the rabbis and the prophets were trying to subvert the public order. And by the way, the prophets, remember, are not always exhorting against other kingdoms, right? They're almost always, particularly the one I want to talk about for a minute, Jeremiah is talking to us, right? To the Israelite kingdom and what's going on there. So I cheated a little bit in the sense that this isn't an ancient text. Benjamin Lau has written a book about Jeremiah. So it's a modern book. I think it came out in maybe 2010, something like that. So, but in a paragraph, he kind of gives a good synopsis of Jeremiah and his life and what Jeremiah does, right? And he says, a small number of prophets were removed or harmed on account of their prophecy. First and foremost among them was Jeremiah. His life as a prophet was in danger more than once. The internal truth that resonated in him led him to extremity, to the point of treason against the kingdom of Judah. There is no doubt that the greatest prophet that has come upon us in the era of kingship before the destruction of Jerusalem, and also the most dejected, hated, and courageous among them, was Jeremiah. He did not fear imprisonment, physical punishment, or death itself, and chose to relate to his people the bitter truth to the end. So that's a vision of the resistor that I think resistance has become in our day kind of comfortable, right? We see it on Facebook and we go out and join the crowd, right? So Jeremiah gives us another model that we have to remember. Jeremiah was not afraid to get arrested, to spend time in prison for thought. So you might want to think about some of those folks. Several years ago, I went down to Ferguson, Missouri. Right? Is that the right name of the town? Yeah. So I took one of my daughters with, and we went down there. And after the shooting of Michael Brown, and they're serious about what they're doing when the first thing they do is give you a Sharpie to write the phone number that you need to call when you get arrested. Right. So we wrote down the phone number, but it's very well organized. And they said, who has time to be arrested today? And I didn't, admit, and I was, my daughter, how old was Alicia when we went down there? Was she still? No, that was the NAACP march. Alicia came to Ferguson. I think was she still in high school?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think she was still in high school. So I didn't fancy the idea of getting her arrested. So So we did not volunteer to be in the front lines, but I will always remember the priest who said, I'm ready, you know, and we went out there and we protested, you know, and if you got too close to the police line, you were in danger of being arrested, right? And if you stay farther back, you're okay. So we were a little farther back. He went up to a policeman who was there and said, I'm here to hear your confession. And got arrested in front of us, you know, and, uh, it's a tactic, right? Getting arrested is actually a tactic, and it's something to really think about. I think, the first time I got arrested was in Washington, D.C. When my first job as a rabbi was in D.C. And the local board of rabbis had decided that, we should protest for the sake of refuseniks in the Soviet Union. So we protested in front of the Soviet embassy. We had a 24-hour protest for months, right? And people signed up for shifts and we went in. And the thing was that everybody was pretty cool with it. Washington is pretty cool about protests, but every now and then we would get a little too close and the embassy would call the DC police and they would come and arrest us. So I got arrested in front of the Soviet embassy in 1988, I think. So it's that tactic is something to think about, right? And it's not something we do all the time anymore. And in fact, we often, when we go to protests, the police have sanctioned, you can stand here, and so you go and you stand there and it doesn't get much coverage in the news and things like that. My most recent arrest was a couple of years ago in front of ICE headquarters in Chicago, where we sat down on Congress Parkway and closed down the road, right? And I'm a little old for that now, but so actually my favorite story about that day was the policeman who came over to me very politely and said, "Can I help you up?" And I said, "Am I under arrest?" And he thought about it for a minute and he said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, then please help me up," So, um, so, so the opportunities to do those things, I'd say my arrests have been completely painless, that was not true for the Freedom Riders, it was not true for Dr. King. I mean, even his celebrity didn't keep him from that. So, but having that kind of commitment, which is the commitment that Jeremiah had, is important, right? So resistance is not just about standing in the place where the police say you can stand. It's important to push beyond those limits sometimes. And I think our next story illustrates that. We're going back to the Talmud, to a story about Rabbi Akiva, who you may remember Rabbi Akiva's end is not a peaceful one. Rabbi Akiva's end is that he's arrested by the Roman authorities, and he's one of the teachers, one of the rabbis who is killed by the Roman authorities. I would say Jesus falls into this category as well, right? A teacher who went across the countryside preaching things that the Romans were not pleased with. And most importantly, what the Romans wanted to stop was organizing. People getting organized, people making alliances, people creating the possibility of standing up en masse to Rome. And so here's this story from after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, according to the Talmud. Someone like to read? I'm hear my voice a lot. Yeah. So,
The sages taught one time after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the evil empire of Rome decreed that Israel might not engage in the study and practice Torah. Papas ben Judah Yehuda came and found Rabbi Akiva, who was convening assemblies in public and engaging in Torah study. Papa said to him, Akiva, are you not afraid of the empire? Rabbi Akiva replied, to what might this be compared? It is like a fox walking along the riverbank when he sees fish gathering and fleeing from place to place. The fox said to them, from what are you fleeing? They said to him, we are fleeing from the nets that people cast upon us. He said to them, do you wish to come up onto dry land, and we will reside together, just as my ancestors resided with your ancestors? The fish said to him, you are the one of whom they say he is the cleverest of animals. You are not clever, you are a fool. If we are afraid in the water, our natural habitat, which gives us life, then in a habitat that causes our death, all the more so. The moral is, so too, we Jews, now that we sit and engage in Torah study about what is written, for that is your life and the length of your days. We fear the empire to this extent. If we proceed to sit idle from its study, as its abandonment is the habitat that causes our death, all the more so will we fear the empire.
So I love this story. I think it's really an amazing story, right? So here's Rabbi Akiva. The Romans say, you are forbidden from studying Torah. And what is Rabbi Akiva's response? He teaches Torah, right? He deliberately breaks the law. He deliberately goes out and gathers people together. And the reason he gives is this parable that says, the water that we swim in is Torah. And if we abandon that because somebody makes a law against it, then we are lost. Right? We might as well be a fish out of water. So, and what he does by doing that, we still talk about Rabbi Akiva. You know, we mentioned him on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. I mean, his name comes up a lot as perhaps the greatest rabbi ever. Right? You know, that's a powerful legacy that he leaves, even though he dies as a martyr to, you know, at the hands of Rome. You know, it's not a happy ending for him, but the happiness comes in the influence that he's had over all of these generations. And the fact that we study Torah now and everywhere, always, is in part because Rabbi Akiva said it doesn't matter what laws they make against it, right? This is who we are. And if we aren't who we are, then we're nothing. So and it reminds us that there are many ways to resist. Right? So some are said, you know, provoking action on the part of the government is a tactic, right? You can see it. We're not sure how it's going to play out totally, but when a handful of protesters in Los Angeles cause a chain reaction that ends up bringing the National Guard to Los Angeles, and then public opinion has swayed in the direction of the protesters, not the government, right? So we'll see if that lasts and how long that goes on. But provoking the government into action is a tactic, and it's one that we don't use so much anymore, right? We've been tamed, in a sense. So we'll have to think about that a little bit and how that goes. But then there's this other tactic, which is Rabbi Akiva here, simply teaching. I'm going to try and get some hearts and minds on board. I'm going to try and connect with other people. You know, changing people is also a strategy, right? So it takes time, and it's not, you know, these things don't happen overnight, right? But that's having an event like this. I think maybe this story is what got me interested in doing this in the first place. Was telling you this story about Rabbi Akiva and Torah study. We study Torah every week, 9:15 on Saturday mornings, and I'd say we're studying Torah right now. So, but this idea of alliance is really important, and that's what the Ecclesiastes text at the bottom of the page tells us. Two are better than one. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Though they may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So this speaks to the need to have alliances, right? And this really speaks to us, I think, as Jews, that we need to be in alliance with groups outside of Judaism. So it's not just something that we can do alone. And I know that this is hard, and it's been especially hard over the last couple of years, because some of our alliances are not as comfortable as they were 3 years ago, right? Since October 7th. I mean, there are some difficulties there. So I would come back to Rabbi Akiba's example that one of the things we have to do is when we see those folks, we have to teach Torah, right? So we have to help them understand that what may be happening in the Middle East is not necessarily what Judaism teaches, right? And we can give some pretty powerful examples of that places, but we also need to teach them that words and concepts that they use can be highly offensive to us. And, so we have to get into that conversation. And so rather than walk away from the conversation, we actually have to be in it. So thinking of a couple of things here. One is, again, this goes back to Washington, D.C. days when I was doing some Black Jewish relations work, and there was a Black woman minister who I met to and got friendly with, and went to Harvard Divinity School, and brilliant. And I asked her about, do you talk about feminist theology in your church? Right? And she said, absolutely not. I knew that she had studied all of that stuff, knew it certainly better, way better than I did. And she said, people in my community are hungry. Okay? We know there's a Jewish saying about that, right? Ein kemach, ein Torah. If there isn't flour to make bread, there's no Torah. People are hungry, So, there are issues that faced her community that kept her from talking about some of the issues that she wanted to talk about. And I think that that resonates for me in the Jewish community today to some extent, but also reminds me to speak to the people who we're in dialogue with and try to help them to see some things that, are not necessarily the first thing on their radar right now. So, but it's important because two can defend themselves and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And on the positive side of that, I'd talk about some of the connections we've made since the July 4th shooting here in Highland Park. That, Cornelius Parks and his church, some of you were here with us on Juneteenth this year. This is the third year, I think, that the church from East Garfield Park has come up and joined us to celebrate Juneteenth. I honestly think we can't mark Juneteenth without connection to a Black church somewhere. It's really valuable and important that they come. But the alliance started because of the shooting on the 4th of July. Some of the first people on the phone to me, even before some of my rabbinic colleagues from other cities and stuff started to call and talk to me. The first calls were from some Black ministers from the west side of Chicago. And part of that was a strategy on their part, was organizing from them, right? That they have been fighting gun violence for a long time. And legislators in state government from our neck of the woods were kind of agnostic, if you will, on those issues, right? Legislators from Southern Illinois, which is more rural, tend to be more the supporters of the gun industry, and legislators from the city were opposed, so these ministers in the city saw an opportunity, right? And so within a week or two of the shootings on July 4th, I was at a press conference in East Garfield Park. I think there were probably about 75 ministers there. There was one white minister and there was me. But some things changed in the state legislature based on that alliance, right? Because they didn't need me to push them, but the legislators out here stopped being agnostic on the issue. And now, I think that our state representative is the one who's tasked with leading the task force to fight against gun violence all across the state. So that changed quickly because of alliances, and the line from Ecclesiastes, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So I'm almost out of time. I'm almost out of text. So great. So the last page here. Let's skip a couple, I think, maybe. I think we know number 12, but just so a quick, see it, whoever destroys a soul is considered as if he had destroyed an entire world. And whoever saves a life, it's considered as if he saved an entire world. I think there's two parts to that point out, right? So how important it is to engage in the work. It's also, in a way, a restatement of that idea from Rabbi, I think it's Rabbi Tarfon who says this as well, right? That we don't have to complete the work, but we can't ignore the work, right? So even if all you can do is save one person, you've saved something really profound and really valuable. So you can't change everything, right? Slice off a piece that you can do something about and do that, right? And you may save one life. If you do, amazing. So, and then the last text, I just want, I cheated a little. This is a more modern text, right? But I think we're familiar with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, probably best remembered today for Walking with Dr. Martin Luther King, but a brilliant writer, amazing teacher, and someone who was rescued from the trouble in Eastern Europe at the time of the Shoah. He was a refugee, came here and taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the Conservative Movement Seminary. So, and I think there's really something valuable here. We meet as human beings who have much in common: a heart, a face, a voice, the presence of a soul, fears, hope, the ability to trust, a capacity for compassion and understanding, the kinship of being human. A person is not just a specimen of the species called Homo sapiens. He is all of humanity in one. And whenever one man is hurt, we are all injured. The human is a disclosure of the divine, and all men are one in God's care for man. Many things on earth are precious, some are holy. Humanity is holy of holies. So, first of all, I'd say if Rabbi Heschel was alive today, I am sure that he would use gender-neutral language. Right? He did exist in a time before that became the thing, right? So please, I hope you don't get distracted by that. But what he's saying is the value of a human being, as said above from the Talmud, is a whole world, right? And so the goal of resistance always is saving lives. So when people talk about cutting health insurance to the indigent, or ending SNAP, food aid, right? Those kinds of things are things that will actively cause death, right? And when countries go to war, that actively causes death. And so the goal remains to create a peaceful world and a hopeful world, a place where all people can dwell together, peace. So I'm going to show you one picture before I stop, if I can pull it up quickly, because Yeah, we lost someone this week who was a fighter for social justice. So this is from 1964. It's not,
Just, I think.
I'm not sharing, right? So they can see it here, but not there. So I also have to hit share. So I have to go back to Zoom. Sorry. And hit share and now do this. Okay. So picture from 1964. I don't know if you'll recognize them, but my cursor shows up too, right? And see the guy I'm circling? This is Jay Frank. So at the beginning of a hunger strike to desegregate schools in Los Angeles in 1964, he was 19 years old. He passed away this week, and I officiated at his funeral on Friday. And so I just wanted to show it. I started out by talking about some rabbis who were important. A lot of congregants have been pretty important too in my life and my development. But Jay was one who I used to run into at the various protests of all kinds over the years. And so I leave that with you, that you can do it. This hunger strike lasted for, I think, 90 hours. No, it was like 9 days, whatever that totals up to. So before the police removed them, they were actually sitting in a place, and so they stayed there. They slept there. They were in the Board of Education in Los Angeles at the time. So there's some pictures from the end of the hunger strike too, where the beard is grown out a little bit, and these guys look pretty tired, pretty scruffy. So actually, the picture from the end of this, I didn't recognize Jay. But if it didn't say his name underneath in the caption, I wouldn't have known it was him. So anyway, this is what we can do, right? So so I'm going to stop there, and we've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I'll stay after our closing time too. So yeah.
You were talking about methods of resistance.
The one that you weren't sure was going to, how it was gonna pan out was the guard that was called out from California. And I started thinking about that tactic. And I was thinking about Hamas, who attacked the Jews on October 6th in an attempt to stir up the government and get a response because they feel they're being oppressed, or the people are being oppressed, however faulty. And look what's happened as a result of that. The government, our governments, Israeli governments, really reacted to that to the extent of what's happened now, and so that the whole world is now against the Jews, most of them, I mean. So I'm wondering, when we pick a tactic to resist, not knowing what the reaction is gonna be, how do you feel about that? I mean, what do we do when, you said bloodshed and violence occurs?
Yeah.
In this instance, it was massive.
Right.
So that's just my question, and I was thinking about that.
It's an excellent question. It's a very hard question, and it's one that we have to wrestle with our conscience, right? That not every resistance is good resistance, right? But a lot of other kinds of resistance didn't yield any results. So you know, attacking and killing innocent people is never the answer. And I don't know anybody in a reasonable idea of resistance thinks that's the idea. I mean, even back in the days of like the Weather Underground here, when they were planting bombs, they were generally trying to do it in such a way that nobody was killed. Right? The mistakes happened. The bombing of the Math Research Center at the University of Wisconsin, for example, killed, I think, 2 people. That was in the middle of the night, and the plan was that nobody should be there, but there happened to be a young researcher and a janitor in the building got killed. And people who did that agonized over it, over what had happened, right? But so the intention sometimes is to get out of line, but not to take innocent lives. And so what Hamas did that day, whatever their reasoning and motivation is a heinous crime. Yeah. The response to that, they got the response that they wanted. And in that sense, I think Israel played into a trap that they created, right? Which is to, go well, when a nation is attacked, a response is generally required, right? But that attack ought to be measured in some sense. This is an American lesson too, right? After 9/11, again, a horrendous, awful thing that needed response, right? But did the response need to take 22 years or however, is that how long it was? Something like that, and involve one country that didn't attack us? Probably not, right? So the response to those kinds of things ought to be measured. And unfortunately, this was not a measured response and might have been for a couple of days, for however long something took, but it's no longer a measured response. And that's right. So on a small scale, I say, our job is to force the response that changes the way people look at what the government or whoever's doing the oppressing does. Hand it to Hamas, they did that, right? Because Israel played right into their hands. They don't have to play, we don't have to play into their hands. And that's the mistake, I'd say. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Program. I have a long list there, and I think it's taken 2 hours, 3 hours.
Yeah.
Going to the last couple questions, people.
I have a friend who visited Iran before all these things happened, actually it was a couple of years ago, and he had this people who seemed to be happy and doing very well. And so he said to him, well, do you protest? He says, no.
Yeah.
Why not? He says, I'll show you.
Right.
It's that simple. Protest, the way they handle protest is test or dead.
Yeah.
So that's the question about when you protest. And the other thing I wanted to talk, this actually ties into, we talked about education. Guess what? That ties in right what's going on right now. We're cutting off the fees to Harvard.
Right.
So we don't want to organize, we don't want any intelligent people to protest.
Yeah. Look, most governments want to run on the status quo, right? Everything's okay. Don't get upset, right? So, so it's our job to get people to react, right? And that requires getting into the newspaper and a lot of other things like that. And that gets harder to do when people just go and stand where the police tell you can stand. So that's one of the issues there. The issue on Iran, it's up to them to exercise their conscience, and easy to say from here, right? But we have the examples. I mean, we have Jeremiah, we have Rabbi Akiba, people who put their lives on the line in regimes that could very well decide simply to kill them, and they still stood up. And we see examples in Iran from the last few years where, despite the fact that there was that we know, it's happening this week. I mean, they're killing citizens of Iran this week for collaborating with Israel. Maybe some of those people actually did collaborate. I don't know, but they're not giving due process and judges and juries and the whole rule of law thing, right? So, but they're executing people left and right this week because they saw this as a fight against their status quo. So, but we saw a couple of years ago that thousands of Iranians took to the streets to protest their government. And a lot of them got arrested and killed, and we sort of looked the other way. So we need to support those elements within who would do something. Now, it's a little tough because, a lot of the people, even if they're protesting their own government in Iran, doesn't mean they love America, right? And that's because of things that we did in our foreign policy. I mean, there was a democratically elected uh, leader of Iran back in the 1950s who was overthrown by the CIA, and he was replaced by the Shah of Iran. And the Shah was as repressive in his way as the imams are in their way. And, so in 1979, the Iranians thought they were replacing an autocrat with less of an autocrat, let's say. And they got just as bad or worse of an autocratic regime. So, but America's hands are not clean when it comes to this.
Rabbi, you've been a great teacher to all of us, and I understand your feelings about some things, but this has been painful for us. David and I, like maybe many of you, although you're mostly younger than us, we went through the freedom marches. We marched with Dr. King. We took our little children with us. We did everything we could all of our lives to have good relations and to fight for Blacks. But it's been very painful to watch many, many Blacks downtown protesting, yelling, "Free Palestine." I don't know if they know what they're even saying, but to see Blacks saying "Free Palestine," to hear some of the things that have come out of our mayor, the mayor of Chicago's mouth, and the vote that they had in the city council against Israel, to see people who, we've all worked with not stand up for our causes and our needs.
Mm-hmm.
We are a people in need right now. This has been the most painful 18 months or however. And to me, it's such a disappointment to see what the Black community has not done or what they have done.
The first thing I want to say is I feel the same things that you feel, and that in the sense that decades of work, where has it gotten us since? But I also think it's really important not to see the Black community as a monolith, number one. So, when Cornelius and his church comes up and joins us for Juneteenth, they're showing love for our community. And that's really powerful. And it's important to recognize that. So some of the alliances that we built on various things over the years are holding and going well. And, and there are churches all around town that have asked me and asked Rabbi Evan to come and speak and help keep them informed about what's real, so those things do continue and they go on. So take some small heart in that. I would also say what we're seeing is some of you were here on Tuesday night. We talked about this a little bit. You're seeing the results of a long-term campaign by some people to, it shows the power and the ability to change people's minds because they've convinced people that all oppression is the same oppression, right, is the language they use. So if Palestinians are oppressed, and I know that you agree with me that they have been oppressed, right, over the years, that's the same issue that Blacks face in the city of Chicago. The other thing that I think is really important to recognize, and we don't talk about it enough, is the influence that Louis Farrakhan has had on the community. And part of that is, again, it's a long-term campaign that's gone on. And it comes in sort of under the door. And so Farrakhan built youth centers in impoverished neighborhoods where kids go to play basketball and all the things that you'd love to have kids in those neighborhoods have. And they teach them to be anti-Semites, right? So that then you get people who grow up with that as part of their background. Again, you know, we did a pretty good job of getting rid of a lot of that stuff at some points in American history. And they grow up with that. And because they had a youth center to go to, they actually grow up and they go to school and they become council members. And deep inside them, they have this anti-Jewish and anti-Israel bias, right? We missed an opportunity to build youth centers. You know, we missed an opportunity to stay as involved in those communities as we could have. And now we're playing catch up and trying to get, you know, it's a lot harder to take somebody who's now a fully grown adult human who thinks they know everything, right? And show them the error of their ways than it is to have kids play basketball, you know, in a loving environment, right? That doesn't teach hate for anybody. So that's a problem, right? And so it's maybe not too late to go back to building youth centers and doing some stuff, but we missed a generation. So that's kind of some answer to it, but I just really want to finish with where I started about that, which is I feel the pain of this, you know, as you do, and people shouting slogans that they either don't know what they mean or they interpret them differently than we hear them. And talking to friends last night about this, that, you know, I've talked to people who say from the river to the sea, and I ask them what they mean, and they say they mean equality for Jews and Palestinians, for Israelis and Palestinians. And I say, well, that's not how we hear that, right? And it's the equivalent of saying, well, I can use the N-word because I don't mean it like that, right? And you just can't do that. And so trying to explain to people that they just can't do that. They can't change what it means and think that we all understand what they mean when they say what, you know, right, what they think it means, and we don't. So, and it doesn't make it less hurtful to hear it, even if I know that that's what they mean, right? So it's just something that, you know, but staying in contact with those people and continuing to push them to think through what they're doing and try and get past it, I think is really important. So I'm trying to stay in the room as best I can with folks like that, and it's hard. It's hard.
We want to thank Rabbi Serotta.
July 13th for Rabbi Moffett, June 12th, in-person Torah studies. If you need anything, see me. Thank you, everybody.